Welcome, everybody. It's a great honor for me to have you here to launch Francesca Jensenius' book, Social Justice Through Inclusion. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. I'm Director of Research here at NUPI. And to celebrate the publication, or soon publication, of the book, it's coming in days, we think, we hope. We want to do that, of course, as we do in academia, to continue to discuss the findings and arguments in the book. Now, the book will be launched in early July in Delhi, with a focus, obviously, on India and Indian politics. So today, our focus is on the broader implications of the findings in the book. And to do so, obviously, we have Francesca Jensenius, the author of the book. She's a senior researcher here, got her PhD at UC Berkeley in 2013 in comparative politics. She will introduce the core arguments of the book. And then she will have a conversation with research professor Mari Teigen at the Institute for Social Research, where you're also head of core. And after that, we will have Q&A. Before I hand it over to Francesca, I want to say a couple of words on behalf of NUPI. And I think some of this you will not touch upon. We're very impressed with the effort that has gone into producing this book. You don't talk that much about it, but as colleagues, we know how much time and effort it has taken to collect the data. So more than 100 interviews across in India, visits to more than, I think, 15 local archives. And in addition to this, building a big data set on elections in India. This is a Herculean effort to collect data, both qualitative and quantitative. Secondly, you are trying to combine insights from different parts of political science and also economics in your research, as is reflected in the book, which is impressive in and of itself. Most importantly, I think, is that you have such a solid basis, empirical basis, for the effort that you're trying to do in bridging insights from different types of literature, and I think that comes out very well in the book. And for that, on behalf of NUPI, I want to congratulate you. So please, before I give over to Francesca, I should remind you that the event is streamed. Okay.
Thank you so much for a very, very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here. I'm really, really happy to see all of you here. Now, I'm going to try to give a somewhat brief introduction to a book. Trying to summarize many years of work into a short presentation is challenging, but I will do my best. Now, my book here is on India. And so it takes us to a country that I know many of you are very familiar with, but I want to give a little bit of the context of where we are before I go more into the specific empirics of what I have studied. What I have worked on here is a group, the scheduled castes, or SCs, that are often known as the untouchables, or Dalits, a community that is at the bottom of the Indian caste hierarchy. And as you can see here, this is the percentage of SCs across India. It's a large minority group that at the most are almost 50% of the population. You know, in some places there are fewer, but on average it's about 16% of the population. Now, of course, 16% might not seem that much, but when we're talking about India, things always sort of, grow bigger. And so we're talking about 16%, that's about 200 million people. And this is a community that traditionally have been at the bottom of a class hierarchy in the sense of being poor, uneducated, often bonded labor. It's not talked of that much, but bonded labor has been a very big issue in India. bonded labor means being slaves, practically. They are also, importantly, at the bottom of the status hierarchy, which is separate from class in the sense that even if SCs have a higher class status, they are often victims of a social stigma related to being ritually impure. And so they have traditionally been socially excluded and socially discriminated against. The interesting thing that happened in India in the early 20th century was a massive policy discussion on how to combat untouchability and the caste system more generally. And I can't go into the details here, but basically in the Indian Constitution of 1950, they put in place a bundle of policies aimed at combating untouchability. They abolished untouchability, made it illegal to have bonded labor. They reserved positions in politics, in educational institutions, and in public jobs, and also put in place commissions to monitor the progress of these kind of efforts. So what we're seeing here is really an extreme case in many ways. It's an extreme case in the sense of a community that's very large, has been the victim of very strong discrimination, and a massive governmental effort to try to combat this inequality. And so the motivating questions for my book and my study have really been, to what extent can a government with institutions come in and change society and create social change? How long does that take? And what should we expect from differently designed policies? Because there are many things you can do to change society. And what I have focused on in this book is particularly the quotas in the state assemblies for the SCs. What you see here is, again, India. As you know, it's a federation. The dark boundaries are the state borders as of 2007. And the smaller boundaries are the state assembly borders. There's about 4,000 of them. And each one of them are single-member districts, meaning that a single politician is elected to represent a geographical area in the state assembly or the state legislature. The way this policy was implemented, the way the quota policy was implemented, was that about 16% of them, so proportional to the SC share of the population, were reserved for SCs. These were picked across the country, and in these areas, only SCs could run for election, but everyone in the population could vote. So it's reserved seats with joint electorates. And that's important for various reasons, as you can imagine. I'll get back to it, but it creates a certain incentive structure. If we think of institutions as shaping how people behave, it creates a specific incentive structure where SC politicians are elected from a majority of non-SC voters. Now, before I jump a little bit more into the conclusions, I want to say something briefly on my empirical approach to studying this. Now, Ole Jakob was kind enough to mention, I have done a lot of data work for this book. It's a very data-heavy book, and I've collected a lot of both qualitative and quantitative material. But still, even with a lot of data, it's hard to study things like quotas. That's also because the second point here, most quota policies in the world are moved around or changed or behave in different ways, where it's really hard to look at long-term effects. What I have used here is a time period in India, 1974 to 2007, when the quotas were frozen. They did not move. And so what we have here is a period of more than 30 years, where some areas were reserved for SCs and some were not. And so it allows us to look at long-term effects. Then we have a third point, which is important, and that is what I just said, is that these reserved seats were placed around. They were selected in areas where SCs were a somewhat higher share of the population. They were not the majority of the population, they were a somewhat higher share. That means that they are systematically different from other places, which means if we just compare the outcomes in those areas, we don't know if it has anything to do with quota policies or whether it's because they were different in the first place. And so to get around that challenge, what I've done is to use a so-called matching design, where I matched up very similar pairs of reserved and non-reserved areas in the 1970s and traced the changes in those pairs over time. And so the book constantly goes back between the full sample and the matched pairs of more comparable regions to try to understand to what extent the quotas themselves had an impact. Then the next question is, of course, what outcomes should we look at? And I think this is an important point I want to stop at a little bit, because when I say I work on quotas, the standard question I get is, well, do they work? What's the short answer? And I think that's the wrong questions for several reasons. But first of all, it's because when you ask, do they work, it implies that you know what they were meant to work for. And I at least have come across a lot of different opinions of what quotas were meant to work for. And if you look at policy debates about how quotas were implemented places, there is no agreement on what they were meant or intended to work for. People have different conflicting interests. Therefore, I find it more useful to take a step back and say, well, what have they done? A second reason why the do they work is problematic is because, okay, they may work to change in some way the redistribution of resources. But there are many ways you can have redistribution. You can have redistribution to certain communities, certain types of resources. And so how do I define which one is the working if there are many different things that can happen? So what I have chosen to do here is to follow a political theorist, Nancy Fraser, in her distinction of three aspects of social justice. Social justice and the hurdles of social justice being redistribution of resources, more political participation and voice, and social recognition, which is crucial in the context of a status inequality. What I've also chosen to do is to divide and look at elite-level consequences and broader social change. Again, I think that's important for at least two reasons. One is a quota policy is really about changing the political elite. And so in some sense, we should expect there to be more of an effect at the elite level than in the population at large. But I think often when people are interested and study broader social change, they find something and they feel disappointed in the policy not having done something, or they say, yes, the policy did something. But at least to me, it's important to remember that the elite level consequences really condition or shape the kind of broader social change you'll see. And so, for example, as I will show in the case of SC quotas, if the inclusion of a certain new politician does not in any way shift policy debates or political interests, then you shouldn't expect it to have broader social effects on redistribution. So in a sense, the elite level changes are the mediating step to understanding the broader change that you may or may not see. And then let me jump to what I probably care the most about in this, and that's the differences in institutional design. Because often people talk of quotas as being one policy, but in reality it can be designed in lots of different ways. There are also lots of different other policy measures we can use to create political inclusion. And so while people might have lots of different and contradictory expectations of a quota policy, I think what I really care about is we should think harder about how differently designed policies have different effects. And to move this back to the Indian case then, one of the strongest and most interesting things I found during my fieldwork was to what extent politicians in India talked about the institutional structures as shaping their behavior, talking directly about the institutions as incentive structures. And so here, as I mentioned, we have a policy where SC politicians are elected by a majority of non-SC voters. And so what they said themselves is, I have to work for all, for the majority of voters. How would I otherwise win an election? Or, I listen to everyone, I work for the majority group, but I give benefits only to areas that vote for me. These are SC politicians. They were very clear that they did not, for the most part, voice SC interests. There may be some exceptions, but there was a very strong tendency in all the interviews that people kind of agreed that the whole structure of this quota system meant that SC politicians came in and became very similar to other politicians in terms of their actions and policy outlook. Now, this has led a lot of people in India to conclude that this quota system has been a failure. And I think this is actually where I started my study to some extent, with this sort of, why has this quota system failed? But I have come to believe that that's the wrong conclusion. And that in addition to the institutional design preventing group representation or SCs working for SC interests, what they have done is to incentivize group integration in quite an impressive way. And there are several ways they do that. With the politician, again, the reverse side is that they have to work for all, which means that they care about and cater to very broad policy interests. The political parties play a crucial role. This is a structure where if the political parties want to keep their political power and win as many seats as possible, they have to field SC politicians. And they have a clear interest in making those politicians successful. And so the political parties end up wanting to strengthen and train and bring forward SC politicians that have a voice and have broad political outreach. And the third thing is that voters in areas that are reserved have to interact with SC politicians. Indian politics is very constituency service oriented. And so voters often contact their politician to get things. And in this context, they have to interact with SC politicians. So in several ways, this is a system that is centripetal, is moderating, it brings people to the center, it brings people together. So that's what I call that it has an effect that's group integration that I think is very important and often has been overlooked. And I want to say a little bit more about what I mean with group integration. One aspect of it, which I find often to be quite touching in the interviews I did, is to what extent SC politicians talked of having gained confidence and know-how by being allowed into the political game. Many of the ones I talked to made it very clear that they did not think they had had any chance of entering politics without the quota system, but that having been in the system, they had gained the knowledge and ability to be effective politicians, which meant that after some time, they would no longer have needed the quota. And I think these quotes show it quite clearly. For example, SC politicians often speak up in the Vidhan Sabha, that's the state assembly, and although they may be less eloquent than others the first times they do it, they quickly learn and get better. Or, this is a SC politician. This one was not an SC politician, I think. Yeah. The first time I was asked to speak on stage, I did not manage to say more than Jai Bhim, so victory to Ambedkar, that's a famous SC leader, because I had no confidence to speak in public. And then he told about how he had gradually gained confidence and was now a very powerful politician. And that kind of learning effect and becoming an effective politician, I think is a crucial aspect of this quota system. Then I also want to bring your attention, there's a lot going on in this graph, but just look at these columns here. This is the share of politicians that become cabinet ministers. The left bar here shows the share of non-SC politicians, so about 7%. This is the SC politicians. So in the 70s, it was much less likely for an SC politician to become a cabinet minister. Cabinet minister is where the money lies. It's where a lot of the power lies. So becoming a cabinet minister, and that's something where we don't have quotas, is an interesting indicator of whether sort of this has trickled into other parts of the system. And while it was very uncommon for SCs to become cabinet minister in the 70s, by the end of the period, it had evened out to some extent. And I want to show this graph because I think it's quite symptomatic of a lot of the findings I show in my book, data-wise, in that it used to be pretty bad. It's still not great, but it's gotten much better. There's been clear improvements, and there's still quite a bit of systematic discrimination, but there's been clear improvements. This also is reflected to the aspect I said of discrimination. For the most part, SC politicians do not report of overt discrimination. Overt discrimination can be, traditionally, SCs were not allowed in the same room, or were asked to sit separately, drink of separate cups. The discrimination could be quite intense, and in 80% of villages in India today, there are still forms of discrimination against SCs. So one could totally have expected that there could have been discrimination. They do talk of microaggressions, of feeling belittled at times, of feeling excluded at times. But if you think of this place we're coming from, there's been a clear improvement in behavior, and it seems that power and money seem to trump the caste discrimination to quite a large extent. There also are reports of improvements in the behavior towards SC politicians over time. Voters really don't care much if we look at survey data and behavioral data. The political patterns are really similar in areas with reserved seats and not, and they have grown more similar over time. And there is also some evidence of less discrimination against SCs in the broader population in reserved areas. This is more tenuous, but I show some evidence of that. But then I want to make one point here about this difference of the elite level and the broader social change. Because I think a lot of people in a way want to see broader social change. And I thought, I have an example here from an SC politician in Uttar Pradesh who said, personally, I never experience any discrimination. People would not dare. But if I come with Dalit SC friends, they will often not be offered tea. And I think this statement in some way summarizes a lot of my findings. Because first of all, I think it's remarkable that he doesn't face much discrimination, and I traveled around with him. And we were let into all the households, we were given tea, and I saw no evidence of any discrimination happening towards him in those interactions. But it's also pretty shocking and interesting that people traveling with him are still potentially discriminated against. It shows the resilience in certain behaviors. And I think it's quite revealing that he's saying people would not dare discriminate against him, which is sort of suggesting that it's about what's socially acceptable and the potential for repercussions rather than an actual change in attitudes. And so I think this shows kind of clearly the resilience of social norms. At the same time, it shows that there have been changes. So let me then summarize quickly the main points in the book that I won't go more into, and that is, through these different empirical chapters, I show that SE politicians over time have acted really similarly to other politicians and expressed that very clearly themselves. And consequently, I guess, we do not see any redistributive effects of the quota system. There are no differences in development for SCs in areas with quotas or not. Then we see that there's a gradual integration of SCs into main political parties. They end up running for the same parties, having similar positions, acting and behaving much like other politicians. And also over time, we see that differences in voting behavior look less and less different across reserved and non-reserved areas. But then we have this point that there is a clear improvement in behavior towards SC politicians, which also to some extent seems to have trickled down into the broader population. And then, since some of you might care, there are also, I guess, some bonus points for the quota seats, which is that the attributes are to some extent different. SCs are, on average, in the population poorer. And what we see looking at the descriptives of politicians is that SC politicians are less wealthy, less likely to be criminals, and more likely to be women. Which, when I interview people in India, they talk of as being less impressive often, because wealth is often associated with being impressive. But, I mean, from my normative perspectives, these can be seen as good things. Now, let me turn to bringing this conversation back to the discussion here in Norway a bit, and how we can think of the findings from here in a more comparative context. And what I propose in the book is to think of really that this example of quotas in India is an example of what I call a policy of group integration. It's a policy where SC politicians have very similar institutional incentive structure as other politicians. And as a result, they get integrated, but they do not act as group representatives. On the other hand, you have certain policies of group representation where people are clearly selected to get included into politics or elsewhere because of some group characteristics, and they're asked and given a mandate to represent their group very clearly. And if we divide some of the typical policies that are used across the world, we can see reserved seats, candidate quotas, etc. I would label as policies of group integration, while you have majority-minority districting in the US, nomination, special legislative bodies, etc., as policies of group representation. And I think my main point here is that I don't think you can have it all. If you design a policy in that way, you create an incentive structure where you ask for and get some form of group representation. If you design a policy this way, you get some form of group integration, but you should not expect people who get integrated in this way to act very differently. And so, moving then to the relevance of this to the discussion we have in Norway and elsewhere, is that we really should not expect, which I think a lot of people do, group representation for a group inclusion. There is a clear trade-off in institutional design here, and it's crucial that one aligns the political goals with the design of the institutions that's implemented to get there. And I think a lot of people find a change in group representation to seem more intuitively attractive, but I think this case from India shows some very clear examples of how a policy that promotes group integration might actually be really positive and have clear benefits in the long run. I also think that this shows that often people are quite optimistic about quota policies and what they can achieve. When they implemented these ones in India, the plan was to have them there for 10 years and then take them away because they wouldn't be needed anymore. You're laughing, Pamela. And I think in other contexts too, there's a lot of optimism around it. And I think social change is slow, and one needs to work on many fronts at the same time. So quota policies, I think, achieve something really important, but one shouldn't expect too much from them. And it takes really long for social change to take place. So that's the conclusion that I have.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for that excellent summary of your book. While we wait for this screen to go up, may I invite Mari Teigen as well to join the podium, and then I'll leave it to you to have a conversation about the broader implications.
Wonderful.
Please.
Thank you.
Okay. I have the feeling that I'm about to do something that I don't know how to do. I mean, I'm going to have a conversation about quota policies, but I'm also going to try to be some kind of journalist and interview on these aspects. Okay, so let me start by saying that I think I'm really grateful for this opportunity to discuss and think and talk about the possibilities and limitations of quota policies. Because there's a lot of both limitations and possibilities. And my take on the issue has been very much a Norwegian take on it. I've been studying gender quota policies in Norwegian context on a wide range of types of quota policies. I think Norway often like to brag about themselves. I kind of a forerunners in creating quota policies. We did not create gender quota policies as early as the SC policies in India, but still. So I will start to say a few words about what kind of issues that I've been interested in and what kind of policies they are a part of. In fact, my first integration with this kind of issue was when I was working as a research assistant for Professor Hege Skeie. When we did interviews with all the parliamentarians in Norway in 1989, and that was just after women really had been a part of the Norwegian parliament. It was almost 40% women at that time, and it's still almost about 40% women. But what we were talking with them about was about their experiences and their opinions on gender equality policies. And Hege concluded in her dissertation that there was more a question of rhetoric of difference than an actual difference being made. But this, and as I will come back to, is also maybe where studies on substantive representation of gender has been too limited in its scopes, in its perspectives. Okay, and then later I wrote a PhD on Norwegian gender quota policies because I was studying gender quotas in politics, gender quotas in public commissions and boards, which was actually introduced in the 1980s and which are a part of the gender equality legislation. And then later, we also have softer forms of gender quotas, preferential treatment in education and state administration, and then recently, gender quotas for corporate boards. And much of the debate about gender quotas for corporate boards, the debate started in the end of the 1990s. The situation was then that there was about 5% women in corporate boards. Today, it's about 40%. But in many discussions, it's like it has not really been successful because it has only managed to get 40% women into the corporate boards, but it hasn't led to more women in top management positions and so on. So that is often the debate on these gender quota policies, and therefore it's so interesting what you are doing in your book. We say that gender quotas, they fix the gender balance, but they do not much more. But maybe we've been wrong in approaching gender quota policies in this way. Yeah. So coming from this conclusion that gender balance fix or gender quotas fix the gender balance, but not much more. I think it's really timely that we think more widely about what these kind of policies produces. Yeah, but first I would also like to. I know the book is not out yet, but I mean, it's really so well written. It's really a very pleasant read, and it's, I mean, this combination of a lot of empirical work and theoretical reflections, and also anecdotes from field work. So you could all look forward to the book for those of you who haven't read it. Okay, so then we will try to as you already has been talking about, there's kind of a trade-off connected to institutional design. The kind of institutional design has an effect on what you get. But in what situations, when do we want which design?
That's a good question. The case I've studied in India is an extreme example of a status inequality. And I think there are many cases where we use quotas in the world that are about status inequalities. They might not be as extreme, but they're about status inequalities. They're also about stereotypes of who in society should hold what type of positions or do what kind of things. And so in that sense, I think that the case of Assemblies in India is a good parallel to women or minorities in many contexts, where often we are not really fighting the need for a particular voice for a particular issue, but rather the problem that some people are systematically excluded from certain positions of power because of their characteristics. So often, I think the purpose of quotas is really to break boundaries, break stereotypes, break status inequalities. And in that case, I think these policies of group integration are really appropriate. There are, of course, issues sometimes where you want voice for specific issues. That is particularly if you have a clear segregation of groups so that people have really different experiences in their lives. So in the context, and I think the issue of women is difficult because in some contexts, women and men can live very different lives. So in some contexts, if women have an experience of being in a home or taking care of children and men don't, then getting those perspectives and views into politics or into power can be important. However, as we have seen in Norway and elsewhere, as those roles shift and the groups become more similar, then the obvious things you have in common are less clear. And it's less clear that you actually agree on things. And I think women, again, is a good example because there are some issues, particularly related to the woman's body, that are clearly sort of women's issues. But even those issues, people are very divided upon. As, for example, the abortion debate in the United States. Or really, women are a lot of people. So women care, you know, have different political opinions on things. And for me, at least, I think sometimes I feel the discussion about inclusion ends up being a bit stuck in that we expect minorities and women to fight for minority and women's things, while those who are already there are supposed to cover the whole policy spectrum. And that becomes a bit wrong. And so by focusing on group inclusion and integration and breaking stereotypes and preventing systematic exclusion rather than focusing on bringing in certain perspectives, it might be closer to what many at least would want with the quota policy.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, especially when it comes to women, that women comes in all
forms.
all forms, all kind of opinions, but still we have seen, although I mean you're quite right when you say that in the abortion issue it is really dividing women, for example in the US, but at the same time we saw in Norway in 2014 when there was a debate about doctors' reservation rights. Abortion was a really big issue for mobilization, and these kind of issues hits women in a very different way from But you conclude that you can see few redistributive consequences of including SCs in Indian politics. But since they're a minority, wouldn't we expect them to be more aware of a mandate to make changes?
Right. So I think what you're saying here is that by being a minority, by being included through a quota, you might experience a mandate to do specific things. I think that can happen. But in this case, at least, the institutional incentives to do otherwise are so strong. And so even if there are some SC politicians who might want to work specifically for what they consider SC rights, and that is particularly about preventing exclusion of SCs from public spaces, etc., which is clearly a shared interest of the SC community. At the same time, if they do that too much, they would no longer be nominated by political parties, they would not longer be elected. And so the whole structure not only makes them interested in not doing it, but it also actively excludes those who try.
Yeah.
And so there are definitely SCs who are very concerned of a political agenda of SC politics, but those agendas are usually not, they don't enter into the system through this quota policy.
And they, or you will not be re-elected if you,
if you push that agenda, because the majority of your voters might not identify with it.
Yeah. So that leads us over to another question, and that is, what do you think would happen within a PR system, like the Norwegian system?
So what I have studied is the first past the post system, where you elect single politicians from an area. That is in a way a really clear, clean example of incentive structures. But I actually think the same thing would happen in a PR system. It's not as clean, but in any context where you put a politician with a certain characteristic into a setting that has exactly the same institutional incentive structure, that will shape their behavior. People get socialized into political parties. People get care about what their voters are responding to. And so even if the PR system has a somewhat less clear accountability to the individual voter, I still think we should expect to see people who enter politics through party list quotas, for example, to behave more or less like other politicians. Now, I'm talking about incentive structures, and I do not mean this in an absolute deterministic way at all. Because there are always individuals who do their own thing. There are always instances in which coalitions align to let a person fight for a different policy agenda. And so there will always be examples of people going against incentives. So I'm thinking about this more as the structure that will shape behavior, not completely determining behavior. And again, in the case of women, I think there are many examples of women politicians entering politics and working very clearly for what they see as women's rights. But there are also many examples of women who do not.
Yeah, and I actually think that we see that even clearer in corporate boards, because it's quite unclear what's the women's issue in corporate boards. And it's something like you get included into, you are supposed to act as an ordinary board member, and you actually do that. And of course, many would hope for women on corporate boards to push for gender equality policy reforms and so on. And we don't know much about why they don't do that. But it's probably because the quota has made it possible for them to get in there, but they want to be ordinary board members and do the board stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's something I think we hear a lot in Indian politics too, is that people have been allowed to enter through the quotas. They would like to be allowed to be normal politicians in the sense of fighting for things they would like to fight for. And it may be that they care specifically about some issue related to being SC, but they also have other identities and other political interests and other ideologies, and they would like to fight for those other things too. So I think this allowing newly included politicians or entries to be allowed to be whole individuals fighting for what they would like to fight for is crucial. And then to add, I think you're absolutely right that there's the rhetoric in the case of boards, which is similar to the rhetoric in India, that if you don't act in some different way, then it's not worth you being there, then it has no value that you're there. But what I tried to show is example of why that is still valuable.
Yeah, and that's what I think I really would like you to say something more about, because why should we care about group integration if you don't get group representation?
Well, I think there are many reasons why we should care about it, and many of them are hard to study empirically. And that's just the reality. But for example, by integrating women on boards in Norway, you boost a certain type of career trajectory for a large number of women who gain a certain type of exposure and experience they might not have had otherwise, which means that they might go on to have a different kind of career afterwards. And so that might not be reflected in how many leaders you have in those particular companies, but it can reflect how they act in society afterwards and strengthen their CVs as individuals. But in addition to that, I think diversity and integration has a really important role within any kind of community. There are lots of psychological research showing that a group dynamic is much better in general if you have a more diverse input, and not only men and women, but sort of various different opinions. And it's harder to express a sexist or a discriminatory perspective in a context where you have someone present who's from that community. There are also lots of interesting research showing the changes in behaviors towards minority communities when you're exposed to them. Getting to know someone is always a good thing. Your biases about someone, your stereotypes will change. And of course, then we have what I like to call the Obama effect, with no one would say that it was worth nothing to have Obama in power for the African American community in the US. He might not have worked a ton specifically only for African American issues when in power, but he has an enormously important symbolic value. Especially when you have discrimination that's based on attributes you're born with, such as race or caste or being a woman, and that discrimination is associated with not having power, then being able to break that boundary, even for a few individuals, and creating that role model can shift the way we think about who should be in power. And I mean, again, this is really hard to measure, but I can only think about the fact, for example, the first prime minister I remember is Gro Harlem Brundtland. And I think having grown up with that as the most normal thing in the world is really important for how I view the potential for men and women in society.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I mean, we have done some studies of the effects of gender quotas for corporate boards. And we've made this core Norwegian gender balance scorecard of 200 biggest companies, and we have looked about whether there's been ripple effects from boards to CEO position, top management positions. What I get to think when I talk to you about this is that we should have studied, we could still study this, but we should also have studied the career trajectories of the women on boards. We should have studied what happens within the board, what diversity dynamics, and we should have studied role model effects. Has this had any effect on both men and women, and maybe especially business administration students and so on, their aspirations and so on? Yeah. Okay, I think we are soon about to ending this part of our conversation. But what I'm thinking is that, I mean, many people and I mean, there's a lot of controversies about gender quotas and quotas in general. And many people are much concerned about the backlash effects, about the negative effects. I mean, in US, they're talking about quota queens and things like that. Do you still think it's worth it in the end to introduce these kind of policies?
So I think the arguments against the quotas are important to think about. And I think it will depend on the context you're in and the type of discrimination you're fighting. But I think people are often concerned that shifting people are going to dramatically shift the status quo. And the answer is often that it doesn't shift things that much. In India, people were definitely scared of a backlash, and they were definitely scared of a solidification of the SC as a community. I don't think any of those have really happened. Mm-hmm. It is a bit paradoxical to try to get rid of a group identity by putting it into the law and making it really visible. Mm-hmm. So that is, I think, one of the main concerns about a quota policy like the one you have in India. But overall, I think all the negative expectations that there'll be less development in reserved areas or that people will be extremely inefficient, etc., have not happened. Mm. Because very often, I think we see that in other contexts too, is that people have talent, no matter what background and characteristics they have. And so very often, people will learn on the job and take a role and make it their own and maybe do it a bit differently. And others get used to it, and I don't think usually there are many backlash effects when you look at it empirically post fact.
Okay, but we need to be patient then.
We need to be patient. So I think in this case at least, I think the quota policies have definitely been worth it. For me, it's pretty powerful when people tell me, I'm a politician now, I don't think I would have had any chance of entering politics if I hadn't had this quota policy because of the discrimination against my community. That makes me think it's worthwhile. Yeah. But, however, I think that a big unanswered questions that we do not really know the answer to is what should be the end of quota policies? How many communities should you add on top of each other? And that is a question I don't have the answer to.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. I think we should just, people probably have interesting things to say.
Thank you so much, a really terrific conversation. It's now open for questions and comments. We need to use a mic, even though the room isn't that big for the recording. So, please.
I have. Yeah. My name is Ånund Hylland. I used to teach economics at the University of Oslo. I want to go back to the topic of the book. Those reserved seats, or only members of the scheduled castes could run for the reserved seat. But I take it that it is not illegal for a member of a scheduled caste to run for a non-reserved seat. So my question is, does that ever happen that members of scheduled castes are elected for those other seats? And do you know anything about the behavior of those representatives?
Take one more, perhaps, and then turn it back. Then I get to ask my question, if there aren't any others. So the difference between group representation and group integration is interesting. And I was wondering if you have any ideas about whether or not group integration may be, as you indicate, more or less effective or good in the long run, depending on pre-existing inequality in a society. Because you could say, to more clearly differentiate the two, to say one is group representation, the other is basically elite integration, not group integration. And so you can imagine a scenario where there is a high degree of inequality in a society, and where you have that effect of group or elite integration, that may quickly backfire, because there are only very, very few people that will benefit from it. And then the arguments for doing it will or may disappear, basically.
Those are good questions. Thank you so much. So I'm going to answer the first one first. There are a few SE politicians who run for election in open areas. There are a few reasons why they don't do it. And that is partly because it's very hard for them to win elections, but it's also because parties, political parties, usually talk of it as reserved for SEs and reserved for non-SEs. And so even if they can run elsewhere, it's perceived by parties that there is a quota for the others because the SEs already have a proportional share of the seats. And so they actually perceive it as unfair if the SEs get more than a proportional share of seats. I did look, and I do in the book, I look at what happens at the time of the delimitation. That is the redrawing of political boundaries in 2007. I think that's a really interesting time because it's interesting to see whether when your reserved seat is moved, the incumbent who's an SC runs for re-election. And the answer is that they usually don't. So usually the party shifts them to somewhere else or they don't run at all. And in fact, neither SCs nor non-SCs run for re-election usually when their area changes reservation status. So when the reservation status is moved around, it's very disruptive to incumbency. It's very disruptive for political power and continuity. But so because of this issue of people feeling that it's sort of reserved for non-SC, it's not entirely apparent to me whether we would want to see them run again or not. I've been battling with that a bit. I'm not sure. Behavior, there's no systematic differences in behavior. However, I must say, there are systematic differences in behavior of the politicians across reserved and non-reserved areas that have been elected for SC parties, who clearly mobilize on their party identity, because there are people who do that. But that's not because of the quota system. That's because of political mobilization on ideology and identity. But yeah. The second question on elite integration. So I actually for a while called it elite integration in my manuscript. The reason why I went away from that is because I don't think it's only elite integration. I think it's primarily elite integration, which has important trickle-down effects. But the backlash, I don't think there is a big backlash against that happening. However, an interesting thing is that, I lost my train of thought. What was the question you had?
No, so you've seen some op-eds in Norway, for example, about representation on boards. And then some people have argued that, well, what's the point? It's good for them. They're part of an elite. How does it benefit others in society, right? And so my question is basically, if you have a country where there is already a high degree of socioeconomic political inequality, and then you basically see some being part of that train up to the elite, it doesn't impact, it doesn't trickle down, then, one implication could be that the support for this in society in general would be reduced.
Actually, when it comes to the political reservations in India, there haven't been that much resistance. It's been really strong resistance against quotas in educational institutions and jobs, but in politics, people haven't cared that much because it doesn't actually change things that much, and it doesn't affect the lives of that many people. While quotas in jobs actually do affect the lives of a lot of people. Because if you reserve a large chunks of all public jobs from a community, it becomes much fewer jobs for everyone else to look at. There is a big argument, though, as I mentioned a bit, but I think I can try to say it clearer, in favor of why elite integration alone is important, even if it doesn't trickle down at all. And that is that when you have inequalities that are based on our characteristics, not our qualities, on being a woman, of being of a certain skin color, or being from a caste, it's a birth-based form of inequality. And by reducing those kind of inequalities, you're shifting it over to a type of competition that's not based on group, but it's based on qualifications and networking and education and class, which allows for social mobility. So in my perspective, this is important because it prevents the systematic exclusion based on individual characteristics. And that's in itself, even if it doesn't trickle down in any way, I think that's a crucial thing.
Yeah, and I would just like to add that for the Norwegian case, gender quotas, we have just had a second leadership study where we measure the support for gender quotas for corporate boards, for example. and there's really a big increase in the support for these kind of arrangements. So in that sense, there's very little sign of a backlash, at least. Yeah. But I was also thinking that since we're talking about what are the actual effects and what was the assumed effects, I was wondering if it was possible to challenge Helga Hernes, because I mean, she was a kind of an innovator of the Norwegian gender quota policies, and maybe she could say something about what they hoped for then with these kind of policies.
I think it's, first of all, I want to thank you, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book. It's fabulous what you said. I think it is the most interesting thing to me is when I look at the world today is how uncontroversial electoral quotas are. Africa, Asia, everywhere. And actually also here, as long as we were able to forget the fact that you need qualifications, because we women said, well, the only qualification you have is being a man, because the men said, what qualifications do you have? And we said, well, yes, well, we are people, and that's because we're a democratic system. So I think that the whole idea of a quota system has a great deal to do with what kind of system of representation you want, you know, and that's what you have also said very clearly, you know, is it class, is it competence, is it, and because what are your rewards? The rewards for being a politician are, well, they're okay, but actually in a society where, for example, academics have a very high social standing, or diplomats, it is still the area that with the highest status where women have the hardest time to get in, because you always have to argue that you're equal, while in politics, it's sort of the representation, it's legitimate if you're unequal, in other words, if you're both women and men. So I think that, I don't know whether you used Hannah Pitkin in your, yeah, you did, because I mean, she writes a wonderful book on representation, social representation, substantive representation, the different kinds of representation, and look how complicated it really is. So thank you and congratulations.
Yeah, okay,
I was thinking that, can you hear me? Does this work? Okay. I was thinking that there could be cases when representation would be the preferred goal as opposed to integration. And I was wondering, particularly with reference to SCs in India, I don't remember the history behind this, but Ambedkar, whom you mentioned, who is still the great hero and role model for so many SCs in India, what would he have wanted?
So Ambedkar was probably the greatest SC leader in the 20th century, and he was really important in the discussion about the design of the quota system before independence in India. He actually argued in favor of both perspectives, and he went back and forth on which design he preferred. And so for a long time, he argued in favor of integration, and he talked about how talking to each other and being in the same room is crucial for differences to dissipate. So he's saying these fossilized attitudes we have, they have to change when you actually interact with each other. Then at times, I think in his writing, he was extremely disillusionized by how hard it was to break social boundaries. And so he said, what we need are separate electorates. What we need is to have only SCs vote for only SC politicians so that they act as group representatives. And of course, he was working in a situation where they still hadn't made all these legal changes of untouchability being illegal, and there was still a lot of legal work to be done that was particularly shared interest for SCs. So here I come back to this issue that once there are big differences in group experiences, then I think you need group representation, because there are specific issues that need to be addressed. But as these differences disappear, and the more you turn into this being only about fighting stereotypes and status, then I would say the integration is better. And I think Ambedkar sort of argued for both those perspectives, although he is read now to a large extent to have argued only for the group representation perspective. But yeah.
It's 4 o'clock, so we have to conclude this session. You're free to continue the conversation. Of course, I want to thank both of you, and as a token of our appreciation, thank you so much, and once again, congratulations.